So hi everyone, my name is Rob Morris. I've been around the crypto space since 2008, mostly lurking. I thought I'd stop lurking a little bit more recently. And I've been in emerging tech since the 90s. I started with the web, went on to all of the other technologies that have emerged ever since. And I've done a bunch of stuff. I'm an entrepreneur, I'm an investor, an advisor, a degen. I've done anything you can think of in crypto, from mining to building networks, writing code, running teams, and so on. Today we're going to tell you a little bit about DAOs. Now, we did have a wonderful plan to have Joan Westenberg, otherwise known as the Dow Jones Index, join us, and that has hit technical difficulties. So we're going to now make some stuff up. But over to you, Ash.
So I'm Ash, and I'm the founder of Jubi, or Jubi DAO, which is a smart contract wizard for managing your token raise and token sales and token giving, lockups, etc. on chain. Rob actually invested in us, so that's part of the reason that I'm here. I tend to be opinionated in this space. I got involved around 2016, 2017, rode the boom into financing my previous startup in biomedical technology, if you willing to believe that, and then the bust through sort of the disillusionment of this whole hype cycle and people just investing for the sake of making a lot of money off of people who are losing that money. So I'm here to build something real and very opinionated in this space, which is why they let me up on stage every now and then. So I'm grateful to be here with Rob, who is very philosophical in nature, so hopefully we can go down a little rabbit hole here.
Luckily they gave us 3 hours for me to talk, right?
Rob, I think it's worth you starting just explaining what's on the screen.
Sure. So we thought, the best thing you can do when you're giving a talk is to give a live demo, a prototype product. In this case, I think we've spent really just a few weeks putting this together. It's got some very bleeding edge tech in it, and we'll explain a little bit more about what it is later. Mostly we're going to talk about DAOs, and we're going to use that as a prop. So yeah, it's called Metaverse in a Box, but I will tell you a little bit more about it at the end.
Cool. So I'm going to kick off by quoting a tweet, since crypto Twitter is the thing. One of my favorite thinkers in the space of DAOs is Chaser Chapman. She's working for Orcapod at the moment. She's also got a podcast that delves deep into DAOs and structures and autonomous organizations. And she literally just tweeted yesterday, "We are a DAO. It's boring, you've heard it before, tells you nothing. We are an ever-evolving internet organization. Arouses curiosity, forces debate about what is a DAO, and makes you wonder who pays the bills." So I think that's a good segue into what is a DAO actually, because when you get into Twitter, everybody says, you got to start a DAO or join a DAO, but what is a DAO? I'm going to start with the literal interpretation first. Decentralized autonomous organization is intended to be an organization that runs entirely on computer software or smart contracts and does not need humans in order to run. Everything can be captured in logic, which allows the humans to do all the fun stuff. Now, I'm sure for those of you who have been on some Discord servers, you've realized that there's no such thing as an actual decentralized autonomous organization running purely on smart contracts. It's great that some of our software does. DeFi is very smart contract based. Obviously, NFTs, etc., ERC20s, they're all smart contract based, but the organizations themselves aren't really run as smart contracts. So why DAO? And I think from a philosophical standpoint, it's interesting to see how communities leveraging technologies tend to want to mimic the underlying technologies. If you look at, and Rob can maybe speak about that, the cypherpunks and whatnot of the 90s, the rise of cryptography, and it's spawned this community of hackers that very much were mimicking and emulating the underlying technology that they were running their lives on. And so now we get to Web3 and it's getting very popular, and people are like, why are we still working with a capitalist steep hierarchy of one person at the top makes all the decisions when the underlying technology is distributed and censorship resistant? Shouldn't our organizations also have that? And thus gives the rise of decentralized autonomous organizations, or at least in some cooperative fashion, organizations that tend to want to self-govern in smaller groups that's not centralized in its authority. And that's kind of what we're trying to achieve with DAO. So when people say like, yeah, we're running a DAO, they don't mean it in the literal sense of like, yeah, all the admin and everything, all the decision making is taken care of a smart contract. It means that they're attempting to step away from that very centralized system of governance into one that everybody who owns a piece, if you own an NFT, you can make a decision. If you own a token, you can vote. And that's kind of the ethos that people go into when they form a DAO in the space. Yes, you've got something to say.
I always have something to say. Do you want me to like delete the, do the thing?
Do the thing, Rob.
I think I need to refresh it. Doing the thing. It's not doing the thing. We tempted the live.
That's because you're doing a live demo of
Am I in the right
unreleased product.
Am I in the right document?
We've already done the intro. We're now on to Jones' bit about the.
Okay.
We're in the next room. So
okay,
this is where in the demo you go and zoom and teleport into the next room.
I'm going to do the thing. Okay, so we're going over here. And it works great. Okay, here we go. We are in another room. We took a portal. That was, oh yeah, we're already past this room, aren't we?
Yeah, we just did the what is a DAO and what's not a DAO. So,
Go to the next room.
So I think the question then is sort of, a lot of people associate a DAO with that distributed kind of voting and decision making, right? So what is governance? And I think oh, you got it up, beautiful. So according to Merriam-Webster, it's the act of ruling on or controlling or overseeing the control and direction of something, which kind of fits, right? So in the Web3 space, we tend to use tokens or Discord membership, or I see a lot of communities out there actually using different levels in Discord. So you earn your levels in Discord through participation. You actually earn your entry into the Discord server by purchasing an NFT, proving participation. And then different people can vote on different things based on that. And so I thought I'd run through voting just a little bit, right? So we spoke about who gets to vote. And I think it's an important point because if you look at some of the news-making headlines recently, we've got the UkiDAO lawsuit going on in America where, sure, as a DAO, it ended up doing some dodgy things that maybe exceeded what could be reasonably expected of a financial institution. And so there's legitimate criminal proceedings against the DAO, but because they don't have a registered company to pursue, the United States government are pursuing the individual token holders who voted and steered those decisions. So you might think you're in a DAO and it's all internet land and it's not registered. If you listen to the panel preceding this one, two ago with all the lawyers Ask Me Anything, and there was also the one with Liza, Boston. The theme has been for the last 2 days that this is not an unregulated space. Like if you're dealing with money is regulated. And so you got to be careful about like running into legislation. And if you voted for a certain company or group or DAO to do something, you could be held liable for that. And sure, you can be all anon, but you know IPs can be tracked, so you've got to be anon, and you have to like mask your IP and use VPNs, etc., etc. Or you could legitimately get into trouble. So be careful what you vote for and what communities you're part of. And then I think the funny example, I don't know if, has anybody heard about the Mango DAO saga? So that's a classic case in voting. I'll use his words. He performed arbitrage on the DAO smart contracts and liberated hundreds of millions of dollars from the DAO. They called it a hack. He then created a proposal in the DAO that if he returned half the funds, that he would be absolved from any criminal activity and it would be considered a bug bounty. Of course, since he had more than half the tokens, he managed to get a passing vote and the motion was approved. Right, so that's something that we got to keep in mind of. Like, there's a lot of DeFi projects out there that just have plain token-based voting and it's ERC20 tokens. So, you know, whoever's got the money bags makes the rules. And it kind of goes a little bit against the ethos of what we're trying to create with decentralized organizations, right? And so I think NFTs is a really big role that it can play there because people tend to have 1 or 2 NFTs per person. It's not something that somebody goes into a community and go like, oh yeah, I've got 200 my BFF NFTs, you know, and they can sway the vote that way. So NFTs as a governance token is actually quite useful in that sense. And I think if you look at what's currently emerging in terms of the thinking for soulbound tokens, where tokens might be gifted or granted by a community to a single specific person and or wallet, which can be revoked by that organization, that would also provide a lot of value in that space. So now you can have the similar kind of proof your commitment and your participation that you have in Discord reflected in a token that can be used for voting and decision making that doesn't centralize decision making to the people with the money and sticks to that ethos of decentralized decision making.
So we seem to have some connectivity issues and we can't entirely show you what we plan to in Metaverse in a Box, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. But first I'm going to talk to you about cooperative coordination. So throughout history, humans have tended to oscillate between 2 kinds of coordination. One of those is what I would describe as coordination by control, or hierarchical coordination. Another is what I might describe as chaos or anarchy, otherwise autonomy. So the thing is that whenever there's a problem, you can manage it by finesse. Somebody can step in, identify what the problem is, figure out a solution, tell other people what to do, and make things happen. The other thing is that humans need to be able to coordinate. It's very important that we can agree on problems, come up with solutions, and make things happen. And so what will happen is that if there's enough chaos, we can't agree on things, we get cascade consensus failure, and where we end up is not being able to actually get anything done. Then somebody will step in, everybody will support and welcome that because they want something to happen, and that person will end up with control. Control is a great shiv. It's great for kind of getting in with whatever the problem is and making a solution. The problem is that it is unfair and unbalanced in the long term. Once somebody is in control, or a group or organization has control and they have power, and humans are inherently a little bit selfish, not always a lot selfish, and over time, power will gradually accumulate towards whoever has it, right? So, unfortunately, that creates an increasingly distorted power fabric where you can, you know, if you're like a participant in that system, you're no longer having a fair experience. And you can think of this as tension in the coordination structure. So once that tension gets high enough, the experience of your average participant who doesn't have adequate power in that system becomes very bad. And then they start to get to the point where maybe there's no difference between dying or a great deal of suffering and participating in that system, and then they'll rise up, reject it, kick it out, go back to anarchy and chaos, and then we start again. So this has been happening throughout history.
So let me just do a little translation there, if I may. So you're saying it's sometimes nice to have a single person in control or a small group in control because it's easy to get shit done, but that often disadvantages people on the edges.
Yeah, and worse than that, I think, I mean, yes, that happens. But even worse than that, it's a system that suffers from essentially it's a multipolar trap, which means that you have these two extremes. You see this in politics. You see there's two major political parties in a lot of countries. This is also a multipolar trap. And so a zero-sum game is essentially a game where it's like speculation, where the sum result is zero. A positive sum game is where the sum result is greater than zero. And so if you have, let's say, a technology or something else that might have negative externalities, something that's going to really cause harm to the world, maybe it's going to destroy the environment, maybe it's going to ruin some people's lives, but it won't destroy your environment straight away or ruin your life straight away. And if that technology then gives you some kind of an advantage, and you're in a fight or a competitive fight against another person or another group, then you might be very tempted to essentially take that technology, get it first, get it fastest, leverage it for an advantage, and push those externalities over to the other side or somewhere else. And you do that because it helps you to win, and you are in a competitive game. So both sides do this, even though they might all think that these externalities are bad, they might all agree on that. They feel compelled to pursue this technology to get an edge in this competitive race. So this is a multipolar trap. And so one of the problems with control is that it inevitably creates a zero-sum game and a multipolar trap, which means that we just cannot actually coordinate on some of these problems, and we create things that affect us all, even when we know better, right? And so you see this happening in the world. So there's also the bad actor effect, which is essentially that, there's a bunch of people who just want power for its own sake, and so whatever power structure you create, no matter how benevolent, it's subject to subversion and attack, and it will be subverted and attacked eventually. And people who want power will pursue that power, and they'll take over those institutions or structures, and then they'll use it and expand the power, and then you get this further distortion of the power fabric. So this is essentially the problem statement. Now, the static kind of monolithic coordination structures that we have gotten us a long way. They've gotten us from small groups of 10 or 15 people to many millions of people participating in coordination. That's a huge accomplishment. We should be very grateful for those structures. They're sort of responsible for everything that we have today in some level. They're not keeping up with the demands of the modern world, and that's been expressed as tension, as divisiveness, as factionalism and conflict, and as these negative externalities we see all around us. So that tension has already been driving a paradigm shift towards cooperative coordination. Getting to the part where it's about DAOs here. So cooperative coordination is otherwise a positive sum game of coordination, where the participants overcome their essentially their selfish incentives to work together to manage these negative externalities. And also cooperation where somebody doesn't tell other people what to do. So not by control, but by alignment or agreement. This has been already happening for decades. DAOs are just the bleeding edge, but if you look in corporations, you'll see things like Agile, for example. This is an example of cooperative coordination as well. We essentially move from these big, static, monolithic hierarchies towards anyone can do anything. How do we agree on what happens? So,
and don't forget hippie communes.
Yeah, hippie communes. So we get to the problem with coordination by alignment. It is not stable. DAOs are crazy, man. These are people who are jumping into the middle of the ocean without a boat and some logs and nails and trying to make the boat as a storm is coming, right? This is not something that sane people want to do. But we should be grateful to them because they are running these crazy experiments. We're learning about how to do cooperative coordination. So we just don't know how to do this.
So you said it's prone to attack, right? So if we look at, I've seen some Discord servers with 60,000 people trying to coordinate activities. How does that make it more prone to attack? And how can DAOs solve for that?
Yeah, so the problem is that alignment doesn't scale into a large group. Every group will tend to trend towards the lowest quality participants. I'm sure you could tell us all about this, Renee. Every group will trend towards the lowest quality participants and the highest safety preference. So if you imagine a global world square where everyone participates, what could go wrong? Well, what goes wrong is that there's always somebody who, whatever it is that you're doing, whoever you are, you're pissing someone off and they want you to stop and they want a rule to stop you. It doesn't matter what you believe, how reasonable you think it is. So everyone's experience on somewhere like Twitter, if they're actually completely honest about their views, is that they are surrounded by adversaries, right? So this is not a safe environment for people. You're not going to feel like I'm part of a community that values me and securely attached, and I have safety here. And that's really important, because if you don't feel safe, you can't be benevolent, you can't be cooperative. It's only when you have enough resources, when you have enough safety, that you have the luxury to be generous. And so I think that this is not player versus player, this is player versus system. That's the problem. So if we want more cooperative coordination, we need scaffolding that helps us to get that. And that's where DAOs come in. What's that stable third option between control, which is unfair but orderly, and chaos, where we have cascade consensus failure, which ultimately means we end up back with control, right? So there's just control on two sides of the coin. What's a stable option look like? So we think that requires alignment. If you can create a community where everyone agrees on what they're there to do, what the rules are, how they treat each other, then you can coordinate. But that only works in small groups. So we have an idea that you can create a lattice of small communities that can each do things their own way, with vast amounts of differentiation between the different approaches, and all agree tightly, and then coordinate between those groups. That has the effect of making it more scalable, because now, instead of it being every person, you've got 10 to 15 times the number of people in those groups, sometimes more. And it also means that if you can get essentially the social consensus algorithm correct, then you can make it sort of like a bubble, right? Like a bubble has surface tension, and it will break into two bubbles if that tension gets too high. And so what you want is, when people have disagreement in a community, that they then walk with their feet, they go and create a community that is exactly the same, except for the parts that they disagree on, and they can return to having alignment. So we don't really know how to do these kinds of things yet, but we think that if it's possible to figure it out, that there might be a stable third coordination option somewhere in there.
But I mean, there's already organizations leaning towards that, right? If we look at the early 2010s, we had Spotify that re-architected their entire structure of their product delivery teams into smaller groups. So you had 20 engineers that specialized into some specialty, 20 designers, etc. Smaller groups that had common interests, would self-organize, and then they'd rent themselves out across the business. But they'd always come back to the core. And you've got DAOs already doing that. You've got OrcaDAO, which I think recently renamed, that are kind of spearheading the nomenclature of dividing your DAO into smaller pods that govern smaller bits of your DAO, because you have small groups of highly aligned people that can easily make decisions together, and then have that bubble up into the DAO as a whole, going in the same direction.
Yeah, exactly. So maybe there's a way to get to stable coordination in using the system dynamics instead of rigid structures. So we move from static governance, such as a 4-year term, static to dynamic, and we move towards evolutionary organization structures. So we end up with something that's like dynamic and granular and organic and evolutionary, right? Have you ever seen starlings do this thing called a murmuration? So they don't have like a governance system for that, right? They're not like voting, they're just responding to each other in an organic, dynamic system. And so if you move away from stability in a rigid structure, you need something to replace that, or it won't be stable. What if you could get stability in the system dynamics by making things much more dynamic and granular? Because then things are an accurate reflection of the underlying reality. And if it's an adaptive coordination system, it will respond to the things that change as they change. And so perhaps where you end up with is stability in those system dynamics. Now, if you have that, you can start to bring back representation. you can start to bring back the ability for people to participate, because you bring the decisions that they're making close to them, where they can be an authority, where they can be an expert on the decisions they're making. If you imagine a strata, everyone in the strata usually has an opinion about everything you're going to do. Some people disagree. There's usually that one person that wants to disagree with everything, no matter how reasonable. But they have an opinion, right? They're informed. The problem with monolithic structures like 4-year term governments is it's just too hard for anyone to engage. It's a full-time job. It's too complex. You're not across the subject matter. You would need to spend all of your time participating in that system to be able to have any meaningful effect. And so if we can bring those decisions much closer to the people who are involved in them, and then bubble that coordination up and make it dynamic, then perhaps we can reach a stable third option.
And I think you make a very important point there. We used to, from our big corporate days, decide to do something a certain way, codify it, put it in a document. This is how we do things, right? But we know in crypto things move so quickly. The DAOs that are really successful go with that flow. If something doesn't work, you change it immediately. If you're going to have a rigid structure and you think it works that way, 2 days later it's not going to work that way. People are going to start protesting. People are going to start leaving.
So we're a little bit over time, but I want to open up for some questions. Before that, I want to show you one of the little things we prepared just for fun is a jumping puzzle in Metaverse in a Box. I'm just going to do that now.
So while Rob jumps around, essentially what they've built in the last couple of weeks is a little metaverse that you can self-build and has collaborative document editing features built in. And so I guess maybe I should do the shill for funDAOmental on this. You can tell I'm more on the very practical side of like building something now. Rob and funDAOmental are trying to attack this from the sort of philosophical, theoretical nature of how do we, you said, provide the lattice to support the power structures.
Yeah, so what we're doing at funDAOmental is a few things, and I'm terrible at actually explaining this quickly, but I'll try. On one hand, we're trying to create an open ecosystem and foundation that is working on solving human coordination problems and moving towards pluralistic cooperative coordination. We're also looking at how to improve outcomes for people in coordination structures, make them more fair, more reciprocal, etc. Given that nobody really knows how to do that effectively, we're looking at translating old ideas about governance, because it's all been thought of before, translating that into the modern context where it can work, a little bit like user interfaces from desktop software being completely forgotten about for the web, and then it took us 30 years to remember all the stuff we already knew, so we're doing that. And we're also doing experimentation on that. The other thing we're doing is actually kind of running our own experiments, making our own products. So Metaverse in a Box, just very briefly, is just a little prototype that we put together that uses, it's a real-time, collaboratively editable document, essentially, hyperstructure at some point, and see what people do with it. That's just some of the stuff we're up to.
And shall we do 2 questions before the organizers come with the pitchforks?
I think we're just eating into lunchtime now anyway, aren't we? So you can all stay as long as you want to listen to me talk, or you can get food, and then I'll stay up here until someone kicks me out. Questions?
I have a question for Ash. You mentioned the DAO, the members being litigated in the US. I think the way that you framed it was voting members only. I'm just wondering whether or not there's a delineation to be made between voting members or members who are just not actively participating in voting. And then, of course, I guess the second question would be, if you delegate your votes, does that give you the same level of exposure, and how do you think about that as a problem?
So we spent the entire Tuesday together, and you didn't realize I'm not a lawyer?
Can you call Harry?
Jameson's asking whether delegating your vote and whether only having token ownership and not participating in vote kind of absolves you of some of that. So yes, not a lawyer, not really able to answer that question. Also, I think what's going to decide that is specifically that litigation in America. I think one of the plaintiffs didn't participate in specifically the votes that is considered the criminal activity. but that were active in voting and steering the DAO prior to that. So it's going to be a bit of a landmark case to see where it goes on that. I think the easy answer to that is, if somebody's doing dodgy stuff and you have their token, why do you have their token?
They're not really standing on solid ground legally to take the approach that they did, though. They would have been much better off attempting to regulate that in some different ways, but they're essentially leaning on some state law precedent in there that probably won't stand up. So it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. I want to just say something briefly about governance systems and delegation and so on. These are really prone to failure systems. They tend to create imbalanced power structures, and so we see a lot of really naive, rigid governance style systems, right? Where I think we need to go is in recognizing that coordination in governance is a conversation that happens. It's not the vote at the end, it's really important that we reintroduce these gradients of conflict. So if you just have two towers, right, and a wasteland between, and the two options are we're at peace, we're at war, then everything's going to seem fine until it's suddenly not. If you can have a million gradients of nuance between those 2 points, then as conflict escalates, you can have the conversation about it, you can talk about different options and compromises, and you can avoid the cataclysmic kind of destructive outcome. So I think we need to see a lot more of that in governance, and I think if I talk to you, Renee, you would understand exactly that there's a lot of rich conversations that happen in any DAO environment, which is really where the real work happens, right? And in a sense, the vote is just a formality that happens at the end.
I think that also recognizes that it's all humans, right? Humans interacting with each other, relationships, and any decision you make in a relationship with an organization or with another human is preceded by hopefully thousands of conversations that give you the information to make that decision.
Yeah. Most humans, most of the time, will do what the system incentivizes them to do. And it can't be any other way, because if you imagine 3 tribes of humans, one always fights everyone, one's always peaceful, and one is peaceful internally and fights everyone externally. If you imagine those 3 tribes, and they're all wandering around the savannah for a few million years, then which one's going to come out the other side? It's not going to be the peaceful tribe, because they've been wiped out, largely. It's probably not going to be the violent tribe either, because they're not very efficient. They fight each other as well. The tribe that can coordinate internally and fight everyone else is the winning tribe. That's why 80% of people will tend to follow whatever the cultural and social incentives are. They'll approximately follow the rules. But they will also pursue the incentives. So if the environments that we coordinate in are so influential over the outcome that we're going to get, why are we not looking at that and asking the question? I'm just basically talking to you, Jamison, but I'm not really not responding to you. I like your face.
I like yours.
Any other questions?
So I guess it's probably both a philosophical and also practical problem, that how do you manage the tyranny of masses in a DAO in terms of for instance, if you have voted and you probably are legally responsible for bad actions, and you sort of want to protect part of your community member from being manipulated by those who have a lot of tokens, and so you want to register somewhere. But in that case, you're going to get yourself in trouble if the vast majority voted something that's
Yeah, that's a really tricky and complex subject.
Do you want to repeat the question?
Yeah. Essentially, we're talking about the trouble with DAOs and and the regulatory structures, and I have members of voting, and they've got exposure, and how do you put a structure in place that protects them and is reasonable? And the short answer is there is no short answer. You can do regulatory arbitrage, which is often a better idea than doing nothing. So, for example, you might want to look at different jurisdictions have different kinds of structures and at least create some kind of legal entity that represents the DAO. You can often have a director who's appointed and has a specific remit, depending on where in the world it is, where they are essentially obliged to do whatever the DAO members require them to do, except that you can't contract away certain, not legal advice, but you can't contract away certain requirements. The director is ultimately usually responsible for making sure that the organisation acts legally, and so if in their opinion they're being asked to do something illegal, they should have the right to say, no, I'm not doing that. And so you can structure around that, right? The trouble is that smart contracts don't necessarily embrace that structure, which means that you get this like divide. Now I think that authors of smart contracts could design the smart contracts such that they embody these kinds of rules and make them compliant with regulation. And we could also see actually much better systems of self-regulation emerge voluntarily from DAOs and smart contracts that aren't going to be as dystopian. And I think that that's a really important thing for us to try and do. If we can come up with regulatory mechanisms in DAOs and smart contracts, for example, you might have certain catastrophic situations that you'd want to be able to intervene in, but not otherwise. You could have a permission on a smart contract that bubbles up to essentially an intermediary contract that is only able to step in when certain triggers are met, like a vote of the DAO. So you could put that mechanism in place, and you could make it so that it's mutable, so that a smart contract, for example, could be published. The DAO could vote to give essentially the right permission to that external contract, and that contract could then do something to fix the situation. And so just as a simple example of how you could do it, so then if you were to use that to create regulatory shivs that would be able to comply with the letter of the law, you could make a compliant DAO without knowing what the law is or how it's going to be enforced. So I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface on those kinds of mechanisms. I think that's where we end up to do it, though.
So I think if I understand your question correctly, how do we protect people in a DAO from the tyranny of the masses, from the big money bags swaying decisions into unfavorable territories that might expose them to legal risk? I think the answer to that is transparency. Getting in touch and talking to lawyers about the legal risk of certain decisions and communicating that to your DAO. Like I understand there's a sliding scale, right? There's all the way from incorporating a limited liability corporation, which is great because that shields most of the members from that liability. Limited liability is in the name. And then you have the Uki DAO, which is unregistered as any sort of company or foundation. And so all the governments might feel that they would classify them as a certain company and want to prosecute them as such. And so you might want to operate in that ambiguous space for certain benefits that it has, but you might want, in another scenario, another DAO might want that safety of a limited liability corporation. So it's firstly about, as a DAO, choosing where you sit on that scale, whether you want to cleanly fit into regulation and corporate governance structures and legal frameworks, or whether you're riding the Wild West. And if you're riding the Wild West, I think the important thing is that the information flow is clear of certain decisions. And because if people make a vote to do a certain thing and you don't understand that, you're from Singapore, in America and in Australia it's illegal, but in Singapore and France it's legal, then you're going to be happy to vote for that thing. You're not going to understand that next time you go to America they're going to stop you at the border.
And there's also problems, which is that most regulatory regimes have a bunch of rules around figuring out where something was controlled from based upon how the decisions are made. And again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can't tell you exactly how they should operate, but what I can say is that, let's say you have a DAO and more than 50% of the people voting are in Australia, the regulator might just form a view that that's an Australian corporation no matter where in the world it's incorporated. You might then end up with a bunch of taxation and other liability issues as a result. You can try and mimic existing regulatory structures. Like in Australia, we have an organisation called a company limited by guarantee. It's essentially like a private corporation. It has to have a board and it has a bunch of members, and each member has a liability of a specific amount, say like $5, and they're not liable for more. It's often used for charities and so on. So if you wanted to make this into mimic this in a DAO, you need to solve quite a few problems. But you can kind of do it, right? You can imagine you've got a token. When you come into the DAO, you have to put collateral up for your guarantee amount, which gets held in the DAO.
You mean like buying an NFT?
Yeah, as long as the liability amount is able to be collected from the members, then you would be legally compliant. So you just need a mechanism for that. And then one of the remaining issues is a KYC thing. So by the way, you're all free to go at any point. We're like 15 minutes over. We're just going to keep going until there's no one left. So one of the problems is KYC, right? It's a legal requirement. Like, you need to be able to identify the members. But what if you did a low knowledge approach to that, where you had a third party KYC organization verify that they are a legitimate member, and then that data is stored, say, in essentially in a vault that can't be unlocked without the member knowing about it. So they know that you've verified their identity, they're allowed to be there, but you don't know who they are, and you won't, right up until such a point as a regulator says, hey, we need you to identify all of the members, and then perhaps they get like a notification, and they know in a week's time they're going to unlock the vault and they're going to know who I am. So maybe you can kind of get closer to the principles of Web3 and still plug it into that legal structure, as an example.
But I think the important thing is same thing as where you hold your crypto, right? Not your keys, not your crypto. Like, you've got to take the responsibility. If you're in an organization and they're doing things that you do not feel are appropriate, you should probably think about either like protesting, trying to influence it away from those things, or leaving. Because you choosing to stay there is an action that you're taking towards supporting that.
Yeah. And not to beat a dead horse or anything, but this is one of the benefits of coordination structures. If you have a bunch of little, essentially like micro groups, and you want to walk with your feet, that becomes real easy, right? You can just go and create another micro coordination structure. You're not locked into something that's really hard to move out of, which means that you have that right to be able to walk without losing all of the momentum of the coordination that you'd already built up as much. And I think that you can imagine that if it were, like, if you all use walled garden SaaS products, right, like Notion or anything like this, you can't get to your data. You can't integrate that with anything that they don't support. And if you walk away from their system, then you have to kind of redo everything. And that's a big moat. That's a really sticky solution, and that's why it's like that. Imagine if you could, though. Imagine if you just had the data all the time and you could plug any tool onto it and it could work with a data standard that just changes it. You'd see this explosion of use come out of that data. It would be much more useful. If you extend that to your coordination structures, to your governance systems, etc., then whatever art or processes you've built up, you can just take that and apply it over here and continue to build momentum on it. Then I think what we would see is an explosion of use of that system, and it would have different incentives in the current system.
I think what you're suggesting is smart contracts can be composable. Why can't DAO pods be?
Yeah, and that people underestimate the cultural impact of technology. Technology is not neutral. Technology changes the landscape, and it changes what you can do, and that changes the values and the culture that is expressed by people in that system, which has a direct impact on the world. Anyone that tells you otherwise has an agenda. Now, shall we...
I think that's a good place to call it.
All right, we'll call it.
Thank you everyone for listening to us.
Thank you.